is Hannah Mullis. I am an honours student at the University of Queensland, and this afternoon I will be sharing my research with you and explain the significance of assessing the climate change vulnerability of migratory species. First of all, like many of the others have already said, we know that accelerating climate change is threatening ecosystems and biodiversity globally. Some examples of this are Arctic amplification, where anthropogenic-driven greenhouse gas emissions are increasing temperatures by 2.2 to 2.4 times the global average by the end of the 21st century in the Arctic. Sea level rise is another key process that is threatening habitat availability. For example, sea level rise is contributed to the loss of 16% of tidal flood habitat in the last 30 years. Climate vulnerability is a useful tool to determine to what extent a species may be threatened by ongoing climate change independent of extinction risk. My research used the NatureServe Climate Change Vulnerability Index. Climate change vulnerability has three important components. Firstly, exposure, which assesses how fast the climate is changing where the species lives. Secondly, sensitivity, which highlights the ecological traits that a species relies on and would be left particularly vulnerable if those patterns were to change. And thirdly, adaptive capacity, so how easily a species can rapidly develop adaptive response behaviours. Performing these kinds of assessments is relatively straightforward for species that occupy the same habitat year-round. In the case of migratory species, however, their distribution spans several different habitat types throughout their migration, and as such, they're exposed to different climate dynamics and may be differentially impacted. A full climate change vulnerability analysis has not yet been completed across the annual migration cycle of a species. My research used all 24 migratory Arctic specialist shorebird species as a case study to highlight how climate change vulnerability may differ throughout the annual migration cycle. They are ideal for such a study because they breed in the Arctic, a region known to currently be experiencing rapid climate change. They also are a migrant, so they leave the breeding habitat and experience different habitat types in their passage and their non-breeding ranges. I have included a distribution map here of the Pacific golden plover, and you can see that their breeding habitat in yellow, their passage habitat in green, and their non-breeding habitat in blue. And you can see from these photos some of the different habitat types that this single species occupies throughout the year. Here I have listed some of the key threats to this species, characteristic of each range. I've mentioned that temperature is an important threat to the Arctic breeding grounds. We can see from this temperature projection map here, areas shaded in green will experience minimal increases to temperature, and that changes to yellow, to orange, to red, and to pink. Areas shaded in pink will experience the greatest increases to temperature in the next 30 years. And we already know that species in the Arctic region are already shifting their distributions poleward, so to continue existing in their preferred thermal conditions. Temperature can also influence the hydrological availability and timing of snowmelt. Fox predation is another key threat, where they predate on the chicks and eggs of the Pacific golden plover and other shorebirds. And it occurs characteristically once every 3 to 4 breeding seasons. However, there's increased concern because these foxes are also shifting their expanding their distributions northward. We've already seen near reproductive failures reported on the Siberian breeding grounds of the Pacific golden plover. In the passage habitat, sea level rise, loss of habitat, coupled with anthropogenic barriers are some of the key threats to this species, and that's particularly characteristic where land reclamation is occurring in Eastern Asia. Genetic bottleneck is also another key threat, which is impacting this species regardless of which habitat they're occupying at the time. Again, those species that populate the East Asian-Australasian Flyway experienced a loss of more than 50% of the population in the late 1900s, which may impact their capacity to adapt. In their non-breeding habitat, sea level rise and parasites are some of their key threats. You'll notice that each range presents a different suite of threats to the species. As such, my research aimed to understand how climate vulnerability might differ throughout migration and where climate adaptation conservation actions might be most needed. The index called for species to be scored by increments of vulnerability against 23 climate change vulnerability factors, like some of those that I've just discussed here. Our results can be interpreted in several different ways. We will explore how climate change vulnerability differs across the annual migration cycle, how it differs between species, how it differs between geographic regions, and I will highlight the key aspects of climate change that these shorebirds are most vulnerable to. 2 general circulation models were tested to compare how the vulnerability scores differed under varying extremes of climate change. There appeared to be a positive correlation between the 2, and as such, I will present the results of the conservative model. So the box plot shown here demonstrates how climate change vulnerability of species is greatest in their breeding range. More specifically, the mean breeding vulnerability is 3-fold that of their passage and their non-breeding habitat. Furthermore, more than 75% of species scored above 10 in their breeding range, meaning that they are considered extremely vulnerable, and by NatureServe's definition, they are extremely likely to experience a substantial decrease or disappearance in range and or abundance by 2050. We can also see the extended whiskers of the breeding box, which indicates there is a greater interspecific variability in the breeding range compared to the passage and non-breeding ranges. This discussion about the breeding range is not to overshadow that almost 50% of species scored above 4 in their passage and non-breeding ranges, meaning they are also considered moderately vulnerable. In this figure, we can see that each species is different. They respond to their environment in different ways, and where some species are able to adapt to climate change better than others. For example, the Pacific golden plover down here appears to be the most threatened species to climate change processes, despite having a global population size estimated up to 250,000 individuals and occupying a large range like we looked at before. What's particularly interesting about these results is how they compare to extinction risk assessments. 7 species fall under both categories, so they have an IUCN Red List classification of near threatened or greater, and they also have a declining population trend. Evidently, a species that is at risk of extinction can still be considered less vulnerable to the effects of climate change than stable and least concerned species. Either they exist in regions where they are not exposed to dramatic climate-driven changes, the species may be less sensitive to a fluctuating ecological regime, they may have the capacity to rapidly develop adaptive strategies, or some combination of the 3. The spring-billed sandpiper here is the 6th most climatically vulnerable species of the dataset. It is the only species to be considered critically endangered, with less than 230 breeding pairs remaining in the world, according to a 2014 study. The main threat appears to be habitat loss, particularly of rare intertidal habitat, which is likely due to land reclamation along the East Asian Passage and non-breeding regions. Land reclamation is occurring for industry, infrastructure, aquaculture, and agricultural purposes. In their breeding habitat, the species is particularly vulnerable to changes in soil moisture and vegetation, as well as fox predation, and they also present a strong site fidelity. Habitat loss is one of the contributing factors that explains why species like the sharp-tailed sandpiper that passes from Australia through East Asia up to Russia, why they have a mean climate vulnerability that is greater than species like the Hudsonian godwit, which ranges throughout the Americas. This graph highlights the number of species that were scored in some way vulnerable to specific vulnerability factors of the index. Species with an affiliation to intertidal habitat fall within the physical habitat category or factor. Sea level rise is another major threat to the species, many of which threaten them in all 3 of their ranges. Above all, 22 of the 24 species have a specific moisture regime in each of their ranges, and any changes to these will be of conservation concern, like how it is for the spoon-billed sandpiper in its breeding range. Other factors where species characteristically scored higher included the thermal regime, their disturbance, their ice and snow, as well as pathogen and predator prevalence. My research offers several key findings, keeping in mind that these are based on a conservative climate prediction model. Firstly, that all species are acutely vulnerable in their breeding range. Many are moderately vulnerable in their passage and non-breeding ranges. That climate vulnerability differs from extinction risk, and that climate vulnerability is greater in the East Asian-Australasian flyway. Currently, the relationship between climate vulnerability and extinction risk has not been fully explored. It might be worth revisiting the IUCN Red List Threatened Species Classification rubric to better understand whether or not climate vulnerability is properly accounted for. In terms of management implications, of the 7 key vulnerability factors that I just discussed, 6 would require climate change mitigation efforts to help manage their threat that they pose to shorebird species. On the other hand, because of the uneven distribution of land masses throughout the Arctic, increasing the size and connectivity of protected areas will aid these species as they shift their distributions poleward. Furthermore, increased temperatures will reduce the amount of Arctic ice, which makes anthropogenic exploration for natural resources an easier task. This might also impose on shifting distributions, and so I suggest they may be considered in future environmental management efforts. The breeding success of these species will likely improve if fox control measures are strengthened across the Arctic. Climate change mitigation efforts would be beneficial in passage and non-breeding ranges also. Protecting intertidal habitat is important in maintaining range connectivity. This is particularly important because no amount of successful conservation efforts in the Arctic will make much difference if the species is unable to pass between their non-breeding and their breeding habitats. On a full migratory scale, individuals in their non-breeding habitat are best managed by providing a more rigid management efforts in their breeding and their passage ranges because their vulnerability scores were lowest in this part of their range. Overall, my research highlights the importance of completing climate change vulnerability assessments, particularly for the full annual cycle of migratory species, given they may be experiencing differing aspects of climate change throughout the year. I'd just like to take a moment to thank our wonderful chair and my honour supervisor, Richard Fuller, for his guidance and support, as well as my fellow Fuller Lab Group members and Bruce Young. Thank you.